Hello, everyone, and welcome to the HGC Post-Show number 5 for Week 5, Phase 2, right, of the HGC Heroes Global Championship. We do have some really interesting questions today, some interesting threads. A lot of the games this week straight up didn't matter. They couldn't affect the standings in any way, shape, or form. And as a result, we saw some interesting things, some weird things. So starting off with North America, we had Gale Force Esports versus Team Freedom. It's a pretty one-sided game. Set of games didn't really matter. Niventic versus Superstars ended up being pretty one-sided, to be honest. Didn't really matter. Niventic did a little bit of a role swap, and one of the questions was how did that affect them player-wise. We're going to get into that a little bit. And then Tempo Storm versus B-Step, again, didn't really matter. Expected result. The only interesting series from NA this week was really Team 8 versus No Tomorrow. And that was mostly because Dryas, who is one of the League of Legends streamers, former pros, who's doing the Try Hard for Good stream, was substitute for Team 8. He played Leoric and Haka only, I believe. And he did really, really surprisingly well. One thing that you want to keep an eye on when you're watching the games is his entombs. His entombs were not very good. Everything else about his Leoric play was pretty reasonable. But keep an eye on his entombs, and you'll see the difference between like a really good Leoric player and someone who's only been playing the hero for a little bit. His entombs were really, really one-dimensional. And I encourage you to watch that series, and it'll give you a good idea of like how to be really good at Leoric and how to be average at Leoric, even if you have really good mechanics. And it's like he's somewhere in that range. For EU, again, pretty typical games all around. Fnatic versus Synergy, expected result. Team Liquid versus BGenius, expected result. And Team Expert versus Playing Ducks, in my mind, the expected result. You can watch Game 3 of Team Expert versus Playing Ducks, and we're actually going to talk about a little bit about why that comp worked so well. But the big game was Team Dignitas versus Tricked Esport. Tricked Esport, again, showing that on their best day, they can compete with a top 3 team in EU. Took Team Dignitas to a 3-2. They actually took 2 games off of them, and most importantly, they won Game 1. We talked last week about how a lot of teams are focusing their efforts heavily on winning Game 1, and then winning every game where they have the winner's advantage, or the loser's advantage, because they'll lose Game 2, but then have the loser's advantage in Game 3, and they'll win that game, and they'll win Game 5. And the upset here really is the Game 3, Towers of Doom. Tricked was in an unfortunate situation in the late game. They didn't have the draft they needed. They drafted too heavily for the late game, and they left Vikings open, which into an Abathur comp is something you can't really afford to do. If they hadn't gotten out drafted in that third game and they'd taken that game, then the chances that they win the set are really high, because they have an opportunity where they don't have an advantage and then an opportunity where they are going to have an advantage. Instead, Dig took that game and then ended up closing out Game 5 with the loser's advantage in their favor. So it's kind of a big deal. Game 3 was really the turning point of that series, even though Dig did take Game 2. So keep an eye on that when you're watching it. Think about how the series would have looked different. Moving on to Korea. Korea was a clown fiesta this weekend. There's really no way of putting it. There were a lot of role swaps from people who are, not necessarily want to play supports, or people who are retiring. Since the standings really genuinely didn't matter. I watched Tempest versus Raven at the request of the stream yesterday, and you can check the VOD after that. Panda Express, thank you for the follow. I don't encourage you to watch that game. That game was awful. MVP Miracle was probably the best set from Korea this week, and you get to see some really, really cool Genji play. Definitely not top tier yet, but good Genji play, and you get to see him in a pretty good variety of drafts on a pretty good variety of maps, so you can start to get an idea of where his strengths and weaknesses are going to shine. And you actually get to see a really weird Tomb of Spider Queen with triple range that actually wins, and there's some reasons for that. Encourage you to check out that game. It's interesting. Some of the draft considerations. The commentators don't really go into why, so you're going to have to think about it yourself, unfortunately, unless it's a popular enough question that people ask for a full analysis, which I can do as soon as the replay gets posted if people want to do that. For China, generally speaking, has 3 top teams, and if those teams aren't playing against each other, there's nothing really worth watching. But this week is an exception. X Team versus RPG was actually a really interesting series. You got to see a pretty good variety of heroes. As you can see, there was a Murky in game 1 on Dragonshire, where he does beat Dahaka, but somehow RPG managed to, in the late game, not in the early game, somehow RPG managed to lose despite that. There were some other confounding factors, a little bit too much emphasis on their late game draft. Murky and Nazebo is probably a little too much late game. But it was an interesting series. It got to show off some unusual heroes. I mean, not unusual really. Lunara has been pretty standard for a while now. But you guys see the Murky, and it's the combinations of heroes and maybe heroes on different maps. So, yeah, the rare time the Korean commentators don't go in depth and greatly inform their audience. It was an exceptional event. So this is my recommended series for the week. Encourage you guys to check them out if you've not yet watched all the games live, or if you want to see something different, or you want to go back and maybe rewatch them with new eyes and a new understanding. So going on to the Reddit thread questions. Team Niantic seemed to do a bit better this weekend. How much does this describe to Kenmon Assassin, Beijing Sport, and Kenmon Non-Sport and Kira on the team? I mean, Niantic did better, I think, because they just didn't care, honestly. They drafted whatever, they played whatever, and whenever you are in a more relaxed environment, you're going to perform closer to your top. A lot of sports psychology actually focuses around how to make people perform at their best, even in high pressure situations, because most people in a relaxed state can do pretty well. It's actually, there's another question from the same person. I'm going to talk about it right now because it ties into this. In Super Smash Bros. Melee, it is often said that what separates the top 10, top 20 players from the upper echelon, the gods, is not necessarily their mechanical skill or even decision-making, but their clutch factor of being able to perform in highly tense, difficult situations. Players like Mango and Leffen are generally comparable to players like Sefat and Plup. I have no idea who these people are, but the former two are gods and the latter two are not because they are in his clutch. Today we saw a top 3 team in Europe go all the way to Game 5, Tricked, against the 6 team, and even then it was pretty close. How much of the difference between teams in a region like Europe would you say is tangible, decision-making mechanics, and how much is performance-related? Performance-related panic tilting, overall having the clutch factor. I think that there's a huge clutch factor, and I think the clutch factor is better defined as being able to perform at your best under stress. Most people have a level that they're at, and they know they're there, especially in a competitive. If you're improving, it means you're good at analyzing your mistakes. You're good at analyzing what exactly it is about your play that needs to be improved, and where it should be versus where it is. You can see the gap. For a long time. And this is one of the reasons that having players who are better than you is so helpful, because you can look at their play and be like, okay, I see the gap. I understand what I have to do to get better. For a long time, I know for a fact a lot of NA players thought they were pretty much as good as they could be. And then they looked at the Korean players and they were like, oh. And this happens even to the Korean players. Crazy Moving thought he was... I think it was Crazy Moving. Thought he was basically as good as he could be. And then he saw Tempest Dami, and he was like, oh, I could be better. I understand how now I could be better. So there's an element of mental preparation to how do I not get overwhelmed and perform the way I know I can perform, even though I'm in a stressful situation as opposed to a relaxed situation. And I think that if you want to call that the clutch factor, that's totally fine. I do think there is a significant clutch factor in the top teams in Here's the Storm right now. And you can visibly see when they miss, right? You can visibly see when it goes away. At the Eastern Clash, when Twilight Dream was fat-fingered in the Game 1 on Cursed Hollow and they just got destroyed. L5 lost that series very one-sidedly, and they've always convincingly beat MBB Black in pretty much every other series since they became a really, really solid top-tier world-class team. And sometimes you just lose it. Sometimes you just lose the clutch factor because you don't have that mental performance. Really all in your head, all of that pressure. A lot of people get ladder anxiety. Same thing. And I think that the easiest way to deal with this for most people is to be like, what's the worst thing that could happen? Like, I lose a game. Right? You're going to play better on average when you're relaxed. So stressing yourself out to make yourself play worse is this horrible cycle that happens. There's more on the line for pro teams in terms of money. It gets a little bit harder. Like, the more pressure there is, the more it is to be like, what's the worst that can happen? Right? I'm going to do my best. And there are some people who enjoy that pressure and play better as a result of it. Fan never plays as well in scrims or in Hero League as he does in competitive. When he's actually under pressure, the more important the game is, the better Fan plays. But you've even seen Fan in some cases. I think there was a game at PAX last year where the pressure just like overwhelmed him and he played terribly by his usual standards. So there's some people who, it enhances them. They like the pressure. There's some people that it pushes down on them. It's just a matter of learning to deal with whatever personality you have. And I think that it's one of the things that coaches really, really bring to a team. I know for a fact that a lot of sports psychologists now work in the professional League of Legends and Dota scenes. There's a reason for that. So it's something HOTS is going to need to do eventually if it wants to become even more competitive, but we're not there yet. On a slightly more serious note, Kira played tank for Niantic. What did you think of his performance? Is he ready? Yeah, I think Kira could easily be a tank player in an HGC team if he wanted to be, and I think that there's a dearth of tanks in North America that are competent. It would require him to learn some heroes that he doesn't have any experience with, but he already is reasonably strong at the meta tanks. So if Kira wanted to be a tank and wanted to be an HGC team, that would be an avenue that was open to him. He did play reasonably well on the tanks in the set where he was subbing for Niantic. But I don't think Niantic can go anywhere until Kenma's not on the team. I think that the amount of better they have to be to carry Kenma is pretty bad. And currently I think they have a real problem with hero overlap. They have two people who play very similar hero pools, which really affects their drafts, and their drafts are awful. So I don't think Tomster and Zuna can be on the same team. I don't think that really makes sense unless Zuna is always ranged and Tomster switches to always being melee flex. But I don't think Zuna's going to let that happen because Zuna always has to be on the highest mechanical hero in a draft regardless of what it is. So there's issues. Niantic has all kinds of issues, and it's complicated because the issues are related to each other in many ways. You can't just fix one issue, and because it just ties in other ones. You'd have to approach the whole thing holistically. Moving on to Europe, Game 3, Dig versus Trick. Do you think the boss call was the right play? So this is the question. It was Game 3, Towers of Doom, Trick versus Esport, and Trick is just losing this game pretty hard. Let's see if I can get this to load. Free analysis by Dr. Cavalier. Man, can you imagine if teams paid me to solve their problems? I'd be pretty good at it, to be honest. All right, so this is the situation. They are 1 shot left to 20 shots left. And here's the really critical part. The boss just respawned, and Trick knows that the altar phase is about to come up. The altar phase happened, I think, a minute and 35 or 40 seconds ago at this point in the game. The respawn on the altars is 1:50 to 2 minutes and 20 seconds, right? So it's in that range. And they lose mid. I actually think they defended mid a little bit too hard. If they'd backed up sooner, they might have been able to make this boss call, and there. So there are 12 seconds on the window right here. This spawns 12 seconds earlier than the max possible time it could have spawned. Imagine if they'd backed up and just sacrificed the fort and immediately gone to boss when it spawned. They might not have got it. You have to remember those holy ground, right? So now they're in a situation where the altar has spawned bottom, and the boss is open top, and either one ends the game, and there's Vikings. Tricked is rocking a hard place here. From this situation, there's no way they win unless Taking Toss just straight feeds. No way they win. This game was, in my mind, lost in the draft. You can see the Haka Falstad were both banned to make Abathur really, really safe, but they left Vikings available against a team that has a Vikings player, and Vikings beat Abathur. Generally speaking, if you have an Abathur comp, Vikings, and you have a Vikings comp, Vikings should win because they have better map presence and better map pressure than Abathur does, and they do the split soaking thing in a very similar way, but Vikings are better, and it just comes down to the 4-man has to be better, right? And this 4-man is not really arguably better than this 4-man in many ways when it comes to controlling the points, unless your Tracer player just isn't very good, but obviously this is Snitch on Tracer. So I think they have a slight disadvantage in the 4-man, and they have a slight advantage in the macro, but it's Towers of Doom. They have a slight advantage in capping altars, so they got ahead in like every possible way. So boss call wasn't the wrong call there. It wasn't the right call. There was no winning call. Maybe if they'd backed up 10 seconds earlier and just sacrificed mid and somehow managed, if they could have raced boss fast enough, maybe. But it wasn't very likely. And the next question is actually about the same series. And this is not a game-winning or game-losing boss call, but it's still a boss call. So here they are, 12 to 13. 0 tributes to 0. Curse just ended for Tricked Esport. They got very little value out of it because Team Dignitas just had a really good defense, and they managed to get a kill, I think, right before the curse started. And both teams go to boss. I guess the question is, why to go to boss? So there's a lot of dead time. The respawn on tributes is like 70 seconds, plus or minus. Unless there's been a boss. Unless there's been a curse. If there's been a curse, then there's an extra timer that's been added. And at that point, there's really not much to do on the map. So both teams went to get bosses, so the other team couldn't. Tricked got theirs because they knew Team Dignitas would go for theirs because they have the Greymane race potential. And Tricked wanted to get a little ahead, so they sent 4 people to boss and sent Dahaka to Split Soak. It's not a bad call. It doesn't do anything, but it also takes resources off the map for both teams to get a potential advantage. Dignitas has better boss race and better boss control, so Tricked obviously wants those pieces to be off the chart. I don't understand why Dignitas went for their boss when they could have gone and invaded Tricks. I think there's not necessarily enough mixed direction. And then as soon as they saw Falstad in the top lane, they knew it was happening, so they were fine. But it didn't really do anything. It wasn't a bad call. It wasn't a great call. It was just like a standard where nothing else is going on. Let's go get boss. I'm not sure it was the best call. It's like Trick's response to getting boss is absolutely correct once they realize that Dignitas is getting theirs. I don't necessarily agree that it's Dignitas' interest for boss to be taken because their boss control tools are better. So maybe they leave it on the map so they can take it or steal it or force a fight over it, something. It's just kind of weird. Kind of a weird situation. Expert versus Ducks, BOE Game 3, triple support. Did the Lily nerf kill it, and will the Toronto rework on PTR bring it back? So it's a question about this game, which I really want to talk about because this is a really clever draft in many ways. Sabanisu, thank you for the follow. Appreciate it. And actually, what I want to talk about is the stats and the talents. So you can see from the stats page, Lily actually had like ridiculous damage. Chris obviously had a lot of damage as well. Lily's damage was actually quite high, and Lily was the battery. If you go watch the game, you'll notice that the hat from ADRD is frequently on Nick. Lily was the battery, and as long as there's a high damage support, this comp is always going to be viable. Because you have the massive sustain from Ariel, you have that damage, everyone has self-healing, and you have Resurrect. So you have a situation where you have to go really all in, expend a lot of resources to kill someone, and then they just get rezzed. And then you're like, fuck. Arthas is a really critical part of this composition because it prevents the disengage, that constant area slow. As soon as Arthas is on top of someone, they really effectively can't get away. And you don't really need that much wave clear because it's Battlefield of Eternity. It's a 2-lane map. All you need to do is sustain, and eventually you'll win the 4-man. Right? So that was kind of the dynamic. It does work. The Lily nerf did not kill this particular comp at all. The one thing that I think was a little bit of an error was actually ADRD's level 7 talent. Bursting Light is normally really, really good, but if your battery is not like a Gul'dan, you can see like a Gul'dan would have double the damage numbers here, right? A Gul'dan would have 80,000 damage, 100,000 damage, something like that. This is 47. 47 is not bad, but I actually think that if you're not going to have if you don't have a good battery, the other 3 level 7 talents are all really good at helping you bridge that gap because you're not going to be using W every 2 seconds, especially in a triple support comp. So not only do I think this comp is still viable, I think this comp could be executed better than it was. Malfurion also gives you the mana sustain, which is really, really important. So you have, 3 of your heroes use mana. Innervate can't be used on Malf, so the Innervate's always going on Lily and Arthas. If you innovate the Lily, you get the cooldown reduction, which is pretty useful. I think the cooldown reduction might have actually even been the better choice. The cooldown reduction at level 1 for Innervate might have actually even been the better choice. They didn't really need vision very much. They didn't really have a problem with the Zeratul. The Zeratul was completely ineffective this game. So they didn't really need the scouting drone. But I'm not sure you'd want Tyrande in this situation. Maybe on Battlefield of Eternity you would. But she's pretty fragile. Lily's slippery. Malfurion has Ice Block, and Ariel has Detainment Strike. So they all have like a lot of self peel. Tyrande, and they all have reasonably high health pools. Tyrande has a pretty low health pool, and she's a little bit more fragile. And she doesn't really have an escape mechanic anymore, especially since you'd want to go Starfall. So if you drafted Tyrande in this comp, you'd have to play really, really carefully. But it might work. It might work. I'm not sure who you'd replace, though, right? Because you really want you want the Innervate for the Mana Sustain. You don't want to place the Ariel because you want that constant healing, and you want the Res. The Res is almost the most critical part of the comp in many ways. And Lily is going to do more spread damage over these long fights than Tyrande is. Tyrande is about picking off one target really, really effectively, and that's not what triple support's trying to do. They're just trying to win the chip war. So I don't think Tyrande's going to be seen in triple support anytime in the future, at least not in competitive play. But I don't think triple support is dead because of Lily nerf. I think that the comp still works just the same, and it could be more better now with some small talent changes than it did in that game. Expert versus Dux, game 2. Dux had Leo put Genji in the Soul Lane. A lot of EU questions. You guys seem to really like the EU games. Okay, so Team Expert versus Playing Dux, game 2. It's probably a little too far forward. All right, so the question was they had the Orc, but they actually put Genji in the Soul Lane? It doesn't look like that. It looks like looks like the Orc's in the Soul Lane. I'm confused by the question, because I remember Leo being in the Soul Lane, and there's Leo in the Soul Lane. I don't know if you were watching this game, Osterman, but Leo is clearly in the Soul Lane. Okay, now he's rotating around. Okay, so we have a situation. This does happen in competitive sometimes, where because of a pick or because of a lane clear advantage, the Soul Lane, especially on Tomb of the Spider Queen, will actually rotate around, and sometimes you'll see lane swaps happen. So, and you can see the 4-man is now turning in bottom, and I think in a second here they're going to clear mid and then go bottom. So they ended up, Genji wasn't Soul Laning. Genji was just holding the lane because of the Leoric rotation. And I think they decided they didn't have enough wave clear in the 4-man, so they ended up splitting Genji off. But the plan was to have Leoric in the Soul Lane, but I think that they expected Stitches to be down there, and he wasn't at the beginning. It was Kael'thas, so they rotated him away, and then they had Kael'thas versus Genji, which is a more reasonable matchup, but then Stitches came down and Leoric left. It's one of the things that doesn't work as well in Hero League because you don't have comms, but teams will switch who's in which lane based on the response. There was a really good example of this, you'll hear it on comms, is the Team 8 scrim block, where they were broadcasting their comms. Glaurung was talking about how they were going to match Zarya Cassia on Cursed Hollow, and they just kept rotating to match whichever lane they were in. They didn't have assigned lanes. They were just matching to deny whatever the siege potential was because they had a worse early game and in terms of sieging, so they needed to match the siege heroes on the other team or they were going to lose buildings and end up behind in experience. So yeah, that was just a matter of rotating who had a more favorable matchup, and Team Expert was trying to get a little bit ahead, and then Playing Dux was trying a little bit ahead. Does happen in professional play. Usually that happens as a result of a pretty sloppy draft, as opposed to an outplay. Normally one team has like a lane problem, and they have to switch, and they suffer through it as best they can until they can get to the late game team fights. Triple support draft review. Already did that. Sort of. We can review the entire draft. But generally speaking, you want to hide the cheese. So the first pick Malf is perfectly reasonable, right? And then Ariel Sonya, that's like, oh, they're going double support. God, it's so hard to deal with. And Playing Dux response is Abathur. Double support wins team fights really, really hard, but they have problems with macro and wave clear. But on a 2-lane map, it doesn't matter. So Playing Dux almost gets, I want to say that they get baited into picking up the Abathur here. Like, oh, we'll just go Abathur, double support, no wave clear seems good. And then Team Expert's like, we win, Arthas Lily, seems good. We've seen Genji a lot this weekend. Where do you think he stands? Is he the new Illidan, and what kind of comps does Genji work best with? Thoughts on Dragon? So I don't think Genji's the new Illidan, because I think of Illidan as someone who actually performs worse in competitive. He performs worse in organized environment. He's really good at pub stomping if you're good at Illidan. It's always that caveat, if you're good at Illidan. I think Genji's actually better in competitive. I think Genji needs teams to play really patiently. He needs to have a long period of poke, and then he goes in and plays janitor and finishes out fights. Illidan can chase forever, so if you've already won a fight, you're going to win the fight harder. Genji will actually win you the back end of the fight if you play really, really patiently, which is a completely different dynamic from Illidan. And it makes him a lot better in coordinated environment where people can play patiently and can make those slow, careful decisions. I think he's the new janitor. He's like the best back end of the fight hero. I don't think there's a comparable hero. A lot of people thought he was going to be comparable to Illidan. I never agreed with that. I don't agree with it now. It's very, very different. What kind of comps does Genji work best with? He works with sustain comps. So your frontliners need to have some kind of sustain. Poke comps are really good. So Lunara and Nazeebo, I think, and maybe Gul'dan are his 3 top damage associates because they get people low, and then once everyone's low, he can go in and be like, bada bing, bada boom, this is my fight. And Dragon versus X-Strike. Dragon, if you have Divine Shield, or you really are playing for that long poke game, allows you to go in and just finish people off. X-Strike is really, really valuable for its invulnerability frames. We saw in the set for Raven versus Tempest that X-Strike was taken, and it actually negated Judgment. The Judgment would go on to Genji, Genji would X-Strike, and the X-Strike would actually hit Tyrael, because the Judgment would come in, there wouldn't be a target, it would cancel, and then the X-Strike would hit the Tyrael. So he was abusing those invulnerability frames. And that gave him the counter engage to kill the Tyrael like once or twice. It worked out. With more playtime, that would be consistent. It would just always work. So it essentially gives you a self-cleanse if you're really on the ball, which is massive. The burst is okay. It's an okay follow-up to burst or to lockdown comps. It's totally fine. But unless you need the invulnerability frames, I think you go Dragon Strike 100% of the time. Otherwise, you go X-Strike. I think in like a Hero League environment where people aren't playing patiently and you really want to burst one person out at the beginning of the fight, because that's just how people play fights in Hero League, even if it's not optimal, then X-Strike's going to be a little bit better. We can actually check the win rate. I'm actually curious now. So we'll go to Genji. And we'll go Masters and Diamond. Since he's been out. What's the win rate on X-Strike? 50%, but higher pick rate. And Dragon Blade, lower pick rate, but higher win rate. And for builds, yeah, X-Strike has the highest win rate at Masters and Diamond, 68%. This is not unexpected to me. I really do think that this is the way Genji is going to be mostly played in Hero League. And I think that's going to be how he succeeds, is helping burst someone down at the start of a fight. I don't think it's the optimal way to play him. I just think it's the way Hero League's going to play him. That happens a lot with different heroes. Like, you don't see optimal Medivh play. We didn't see optimal Lunara play for a long time until pros started taking Splintered Spear, and then people were like, oh, I get it. You stand back and wear everyone down and let your team finish them off. I get it. It's just the way it is. Chromie W build that was seen, is that for wave clear? Okay, there's more than one Chromie W build that was seen. You can actually, we'll scroll up here. I don't know if these replays are up on masterleague.net, so I don't know if the builds will be available. We'll see. All right, so there was a Chromie W build that went Time Walker's Pursuit at 1 and then W at 4 and 7. That build is awful. Never do that. It doesn't make sense. The math doesn't work out. Like, it's just not an optimal build by any stretch of the imagination. Don't ever go that build. It's actually awful. But the full W build, and we saw a couple of them. Apparently the replays aren't up, or they would be parsed in. The full W build is pretty good for wave clear. And if you find yourself in a draft where you needed Chromie and you needed poke, and you were short on wave clear, then it would be, who did that build? McIntyre. It was in the B-step game. If you find yourself in a situation where you're really short on wave clear, then it's reasonable. But otherwise, the W build is just not very good. The W build is a wave clear build, though, and sometimes, I mean, wave clear is in many ways the most critical thing in the entire game. So if you're in a comp with no wave clear, it's not bad to go W build. It's not even bad just to go Mobius Loop at 7 and skip out on Dragon's Eye if you desperately need wave clear. It's totally reasonable to do. It's good enough and competitive. It pairs really well with Mobius Loop also pairs really well with Slowing Sands if you're playing patiently and zoning a team. You get that poke value. I would actually prefer Mobius Loop to be the pickup every time we see Slowing Sands. Personally, I don't think Dragon's Eye is quite as good at Chromie's role of poking people out. Dragon's Eye is good at finishing people off, and I don't think that's Chromie's role as a poke hero, if that makes sense. But I think Dragon's Eye is good in some situations, especially with Loop. So there's definitely a dynamic there that can be analyzed and addressed in your personal play. Both Dignitas and Liquid are known as LAN teams. Do you think it's a bit harsh that only 2 places are accorded to Europe for the mid-season brawl? I don't think that you can say that. They are both known as LAN teams. Dignitas is known as LAN team. Liquid's not known as LAN team. Liquid is a league team. Liquid has historically not done well at any LAN. They do really well when they have time to prepare. Fnatic is considered a LAN team by many people. So I think that might have been the question to Dignitas and Fnatic. Do you think it's a bit harsh only 2 places are accorded to Europe for the mid-season brawl? I think it's just fair. Like, it's 2 per region. There's a stepladder playoff. Your placement in the league matters. Europe definitely has a deeper roster than any other region. Europe has a deeper competitive pool than any other team. I still think L5 is the top team in the world. I don't know. NB Black is in that level with the top 3 EU teams. I think that's fair to say. And L5 is just a little tiny marginally above those 4. And that's right now. By the time the midseason brawl comes around, with the amount of improvement we've seen from all the teams, that might change. But you're going to have teams. You're going to have regions that have an amazing, one amazing team like Nomia is literally the only competitive team from their region. And they're a minor region. But they're good enough to take games off of top EU teams, and the top EU team is arrogant and lets themselves get outdrafted. So it's just the nature of the beast. You can only have so many teams. You can only have so many games played. And I think if Dignitas and Fnatic make it, we're going to be in a pretty interesting series. If Dignitas doesn't make it, I don't know if Liquid's... If Dignitas doesn't make it, I don't know if Liquid's going to have a good showing. Honestly, if Liquid is the team that makes it to mid-season brawl, because they're really not a tournament team. They don't excel in that environment. And it's going to be interesting. And this last question is actually from Ghost Dunk, who always asks pretty good questions. And going into the mid-season brawl, a general question, Sam Walker has a book called The Captain Class, which says that the common thread among dominant athletic sports teams that consistently win championships is the captain of the team. Not the superstar, not the coach, but the player that is the leader of the team in a social dimension. Walker found that the captain was the most important variable in these team success. Do you see this at all in esports? Yes. 100%. There's a difference between someone who's really, really good at the game and someone who inspires other people to do their best. There's a huge difference between those things. And Bakery is a captain. Bakery is the absolute leader of Dignitas. When Bakery is focused on keeping his team's morale up and, saying, we're going to win this, they win this. That's one of the reasons they're such a strong tournament team, is because Bakery is such a strong captain for Dignitas. And in Hero League, so this is something I think a lot of people can into it. If you're playing Hero League and someone's just being absolutely toxic, or they're being really annoying, or they're making terrible decisions, and you're just like, and then they're talking, right? You're like, I don't want this person to win. Most people check out of the game a little bit. They stop paying as much attention because they're just like, I don't care about this game as much. And it sounds ridiculous in some ways. You're like, I don't care if I lose because I just don't want that guy to win. I mean, show of hands in chat. Who's had that happen in Hero League? Think about it. Think about an instance where there's one guy who's just being toxic, and you were just like, I don't care if I win or lose this game anymore. I just don't want to be with this person, right? You're like, mentally, you keep playing, but maybe mentally you check out. Maybe you're not as focused. How often does that happen to you? And probably not very often, because there's not that many people who are terribly toxic in this game. By absolute numbers, everyone has an off day here and there. So that happens to competitive teams. If you don't like someone on your team and you're forced to scrim with them every day, God, you're not going to do your best. You're just not going to do your best. Player compatibility, player personality compatibility, player synergy is actually really important. thinking it's not is one of the things that has held a lot of NA teams back, because they'll have these people who just have no compatibility on a roster, and that roster will like have really inconsistent performance. Sometimes on the day those people are getting along, they'll be fine. On the day they aren't getting along, they'll just lose every single game. Player compatibility matters a ton. A leader of a team can make people get along all the time, can put them in that mental mindset where they want to win, want to support their team 100% of the time. And Teammate is a really good example of this. Teammate was a team. Prismaticism was considered a toxic player. He doesn't listen to calls. He's gotten booted off more than one pro team as a result. He goes to Teammate. It's fine. Prismaticism gets along with everyone. Prismaticism listens to glowering shot calling and does what he's told. Prismaticism, it was almost the breakout player for Teammate when it came to their season 1 standings. The only, his rag play was top tier. He only got overshadowed by Justing in many ways, because Justing had actually always been one of the best tanks in NA, but it wasn't visible because he was so preoccupied with shot calling that he couldn't focus on his own play. When as soon as that shot calling burden was taken away from him, his stellar tank play came to the fore immediately. So player compatibility matters, and a good captain puts you in a situation where you're always going to have that compatibility 100% of the time, because he's going to be the leader of the team, and that matters. So that matters in esports. It just absolutely matters that teams work together as a team in a team-focused game. Bud's a legend. Bud's actually improved a lot as a support. I think Bud's improvement was focused on playing the game correctly. Buds would often try and compensate for his team's positioning errors as a support in ways that he couldn't. Like there's certain positioning errors that you can't fix as a support, and depending on which support you play, the areas you can fix are different. But he would always try to fix it regardless of what he was playing. I think Glau's constant shot calling, where he's always telling people, no, back up, just and like on and on and on and on and on, fixed a lot of Bud's issues, and he started to trust his team more because he trusted his shot caller. And when you trust your shot caller and everyone's following the shot caller's calls, you're in good shape. One of the worst things you can do if you're in like a 5-stack is not listening to your shot caller. It doesn't matter if shot caller's right or not. It just matters that you listen to them. And you'll be able to do things. And it'll be really obvious when their call's wrong if everyone actually listens to the call. But it's not always going to be obvious that the call is wrong if you don't listen to the shot caller, and then you won't improve as a team if the shot caller won't get any better. It's hard being a team leader? Yes. It is very difficult to be a competent team captain. And that, they're even rarer than tank players in the competitive scene. Good tank players are pretty rare. So that's all the Reddit questions. If there's any questions from